Hello, everybody. We've got a really good show today. I wanted to first welcome Katie Halper. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, thanks for
Uh,
having me.
Lots of you already know Katie because we restream her stuff a lot. When I'm trying to get information about what's going on in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, I love the Gray Zone, of course, Max Blumenthal and Aaron Matei. I love Richard Medhurst. I love Owen Jones. But the show I watch the most is Katie's show.
Oh,
Oh,
thanks.
absolutely. And I even see it live. It's really hard for me to find time to sit down and watch a live stream, but I when I can, I do it. It's a very entertaining show. And I didn't know until I did some deeper research into you. You were actually a comedian in addition to being a journalist.
I used to do stand up and now I guess I focus my creative energies more on my shows, but I would like to do more stand up and I do it every now and again for political causes. Like I would do a lot of Julian Assange events. It's crazy to think that we don't have to do those anymore.
I know. And I hope he physically recovers from the
Yeah.
ordeal they put him through. I mean, people have no idea what.
Yeah, it was torture.
Yeah, it was literal torture. I mean,
Yeah,
you don't
the
have to
special
stick needles into somebody for it to be tortured, to put them in
right.
conditions like that.
And the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, Nils Melzer, determined it was torture. So not even just using that kind of casually, it was actually officially classified as that by obviously an expert. Who, by the way, he has a great book. I believe it's called The Trial of Julian Assange. And what's interesting about Nils Melzer is that he did not start out sympathetic to Julian Assange, which he's
Oh.
open about in the book. Yeah, he kind of drank the Kool-Aid or believed the propaganda about him. So when he looked into it, he was not looking into it as kind of an ally.
Oh, interesting. So he started out skeptic, objective.
Yeah.
That's the best. That's the
Yeah,
best when
exactly.
somebody starts there.
Right.
Now your show, I was trying to think, what is the name of Katie's show? Now it's probably the Katie Halper Show,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. Not very
Okay.
creative.
Okay. But so if you're looking for it, definitely that's where to find it. Um, so I want to go into your background a little bit.
Sure.
You grew up on the Upper West Side. I happened to spend my 20s on the Upper West Side in the 1980s. And it is a very Jewish place. I think no two ways about it, right? Um, and the cult, and now I want to get into what is Jewish. I know this is a huge topic. And the reason is we have a country right now over in the Middle East, aiming to represent Jews, which is, of course, a travesty. And we're trying to come at this from as many different angles as possible. We had an Orthodox rabbi on, you know him, Yaakov
Yaakov
Shapiro,
Shapiro. Yeah.
who I love. I
Yeah.
love
He's
that guy.
great. He's great.
And he came at it from a deeply religious, devout Jew. He follows, I guess there's 650 laws, and his job is to figure out what the law is and to follow it and to teach the other people in his flock what the laws are. Okay, so that's one angle. But then there is the I guess for lack of a word, ethnic Jew. Like I'm half Italian, half Irish. So theoretically, I'm Irish Italian. I love my ancestors. I revere what they did to get to the point where I could be and I could eat and go to school. Um, but I'm not really Italian and I'm not really Irish.
Yeah.
I'm an American guy living in America, but I respect that tradition. So where do you fall on this? And by the way, of course, I was raised a Catholic because, Irish Italian. I
Right.
haven't been to Catholic Mass since I was 18. So I guess I'm called a lapsed Catholic, which I think
Right.
is absurd. I'm just not a Catholic, guys, right?
Yeah.
So where do you fall on this spectrum? Obviously, you're probably not an Orthodox Jewish rabbi,
No, not that I know of, not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
but
No,
so yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, it's interesting. So I really respect Rabbi Shapiro. I've had him on a lot and I actually consider him a friend. He and I probably disagree over our definition of what Jewish means. For me, being Jewish, and I'm not saying everyone has to subscribe to this. I think there are people who identify as being Jewish because they're religious. My identification with being Jewish is a cultural, ethnic one. I guess cultural is a safer word to say because when you talk about ethnicity, you get into like genetics and all this stuff. Yeah, so I'm not at all religious, but I identify very much as a cultural Jew. Um, Also, we have to remember that it's interesting. Like, I can choose whether to identify as Jewish or not, but My mom couldn't. Her name was Eisenberg, and she grew up in the Bronx. And I guess there were Irish Catholic schools. And then, I mean, my mom didn't go to a Jewish school, but I guess the Irish Catholic kids knew which ones were Jewish. And they, would throw rocks at her and my uncle.
Mm,
And I just bring that up because it is an interesting question of defining ourselves and identifying. And again, I've never faced anti-Semitism, but it is something that maybe some people were like, oh, you're not Jewish unless you're religious. Well, the world treated us as something else. Like Hitler, I think being a Jew was having one Jewish grandparent. Now, of course, people will say, well, you shouldn't share a definition with Hitler. And of course, I don't at all do follow Hitler's teachings. It's like the biggest understate. He was a monster. But I guess it speaks to the fact that the world defined us that way. And when the world defines you that way, you're going to develop a certain community and culture. And for me, there's this rich secular Jewish tradition. And it's really Ashkenazi, the one that I come from. It's funny, like I realize how things that we consider Jewish are so often really, because there's different Jewish cultures
right.
there's Mizrahi, which are the ones from the Middle East and Africa. Then there's Sephardic, who come from Spain, and then Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe. And the things that I think in the States we consider Jewish culturally are really Ashkenazi, or someone like Larry David, for instance, of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Right.
Anyway, so for me, I also come from a particular, I think radical secular Jewish tradition,
Mm-hmm.
where interestingly enough, they were secular, but they also had the kind of lessons of the Torah and the prophets. The prophets had some kind of radical or what we would call, I guess, social justice oriented teachings. And so and there's also the culture of Yiddish, which I don't speak, but my great grandparents spoke it. And that again is an Ashkenazi thing. That's something, that Eastern European Jews spoke. That's a whole other story about how
It was kind of like this. It was kind of like the Swahili of Jewish people in New York City. It was a language that just everybody that was Jewish spoke, or a lot of Jewish people spoke of that generation.
Of a certain generation,
There used to be Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish theater.
Yeah.
One of my best friend's grandfather was a Yiddish theater star.
Oh wow, cool.
Yeah.
And Israel, this is a whole other discussion. Israel really ruined Yiddish. It killed it and made people speak made up modern Hebrew that didn't exist. But I went to a secular Jewish summer camp that was I went there and worked there. It was founded by Yiddish speaking socialists and communists. My mom went there. My uncle went there. My grandma actually worked there and went there on a scholarship. And I actually made a documentary that's coming out soon called Commie Camp, which is about it. And the camp still exists. It's called Kinderland. So highly recommend it for people to send their kids.
Where is it?
And thanks to my movie, a lot of people have sent their kids there.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
So
it's in the Berkshires.
It's called Kinderland?
Kinderland, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And it's in the Berkshires, and it used to be upstate New York. And then it kind of traveled around and it almost shut down during the McCarthy era. Paul Robeson visited it.
Oh, wow.
Pete Seeger. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just a sidebar. When I think of Jewish culture, I think of first charity. I think of justice.
Yeah.
Like these are I always thought were very high value. There's a joke. When Italians get rich, they commission a statue to Columbus. When Jews get rich, they build a hospital. That's right. Funny, and I can say that as an Italian, half Italian American. It's just that always was what I thought the culture was about.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's even a concept that comes from from Judaism, the religion, called Tikkun Olam, which means to repair the world. And also because of history and because of diaspora, you had a very, an internationalist tradition, and which gets into kind of Israel and Zionism and why it's anathema to so much Jewish culture and history, because it was all about like being where you were. And in fact, the Bundes even had a slogan that has to do that with like here-ness. And yeah, there was a sense of internationalism. And of course, it was very kind of book-based. There's a rabbinical tradition of being very intellectual and studying. And so there are lots of ways which doesn't necessarily lead to radicalism, but it certainly can. And there's just a tradition of real internationalist, solidaristic Jewish history and
Yeah,
culture.
and then the experience of being victimized in various places
Right.
at various times.
Yeah.
So these are the Jewish values I think of when someone goes, well, what are Jewish values?
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time on the Upper West Side, almost 10 years. And like, I think I mentioned one of my best friends went to Dalton. I went to Regis, which is kind of
Okay.
near Dalton,
Catholic
right?
school, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now I didn't throw rocks at anybody, okay?
Good.
That was
Thank
a whole
you.
nother generation.
Yeah.
Though interestingly enough, my Italian grandmother grew up in the Bronx. We were a Bronx family.
Oh, so is my
And it
mom.
was a mixed Jewish Italian neighborhood.
Right.
And she never said oy vey, but she always used to say oy ma, kind of like
Huh.
like a hybrid between Yiddish and Italian.
Yeah, that's
Um,
funny. Yeah.
but there was, back in the old days, people did tend to live with their community because it was more comfortable. And they were new immigrants, a lot of them. And so they could get the food they were used to, the language they were used to, friends and fellow village people that they
Right.
knew back in the, so it made sense. And then of course over the generations, we became more prosperous, all the different groups, and moved to the suburbs and all the other
Right.
stuff we do. But there was you know, the Italians lived here, the Irish lived here, Jews
Right.
lived here, and so on.
Yeah.
So as I mean, this is sort of a loaded question, and it's the answer is kind of obvious, or leading question. I mean, how do you feel as a cultural Jew who holds the values of justice and charity so highly, to look at what's going on in Israel and having the Israeli madhouse claim to represent Judaism?
Yeah. Well, I also want to just say one thing, which is that for me, I identify more with the sense of justice than charity. It's
Hmm.
kind of because justice is about, I think, fairness and what people deserve, as opposed to charity, which is kind of definitionally like not necessarily you're not entitled to. It's almost like a
Understood.
privilege instead of a right.
Sure,
But yeah, there's
sure.
definitely that tradition. So I'm sorry. How do I feel about Israel, you
Yeah,
said? Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of obvious. The answer's sort of obvious,
Right.
but
I love it.
people,
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, I mean, Israel is, I think, a major stain on, well, no, I don't want to say that because it's actually not. I think Israel, a couple things. One is it doesn't speak for me. It doesn't speak for lots of Jews. But the other irony is that it creates anti-Semitism by claiming to act in the name of Jews, because it's live streaming its crimes against humanity, saying that it's on behalf of Jews, that it's being done by Jews. And that's not good for Jews, honestly. Uh,
yeah,
a- and it also is interesting because they try to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And that also creates anti-Semitism, but it doesn't just create anti-Semitism in the way I explained. It actually is based on an anti-Semitic trope of the dual loyalty trope, which is that, Jews aren't really loyal to the country that they live in because they have this overriding loyalty to Israel, and that Jews are like a monolith and we all support Israel. So all of this is really dangerous. And, what's interesting is that not only are there a lot of anti-Zionist Jews, but Jewish anti-Zionism has existed ever since Zionism existed. Zionism used to be this fringe thing, which majority of Jews oppose for various reasons, some political, some religious. And, Zionism requires anti-Semitism. It thinks that you're never going to get rid of anti-Semitism. And if that's the case, and it also justifies your political project, then you're not going to really focus on getting rid of it. In fact, you may actually need it. Whereas there are a lot of, more leftist Jews who thought, no, we need to fight against anti-Semitism and make the world a better place where we're living, not kind of flee and go to this other country. But it's really tragic because then after the Holocaust, for a lot of Jews, there weren't that many places, survivors, there weren't that many places to go because the West didn't welcome them in. And then they went to Israel, which was a colonial project that the West supported, because basically instead of actually letting these people into their countries, they shipped them off, pretending that it was for the sake of Jews. And you created then Zionism became more popular. And again, it was fringe before.
well, I hear that some of that first generation of Yiddish speaking Jews that went to Israel were treated really badly.
Oh yeah. So I'm actually working on a documentary right now about Holocaust survivors who are speaking out against the genocide. And what's fascinating is that Yiddish came up in a few of the interviews because Yiddish was considered the language of the diaspora Jew, the shtetl Jew, the kind of, the religious Jew. Israel was really intent on creating a new Jew that rejected kind of assimilated Jews and rejected shtetl Jews and rejected Yiddish-speaking Jews. And one of the people I interviewed is a fascinating person. His name is Jacques Boud. He's from Brussels, and he mentioned how much he liked Yiddish. But another really, really amazing person I interviewed is a son of a survivor. His name is Haim Brashith. He actually wrote a book called An Army Like No Other, which is about the Israeli army. And he mentions that he, as a kid in Israel, went to see a Yiddish version of Hamlet, and it got raided by the Israeli police. And so both of them brought up the fact that Yiddish was discouraged and in some cases banned by Israel. And both Jacques and Haim, because Haim grew up in Israel, Jacques was sent to Israel for a few years. Both of them brought up the fact that Israelis would call survivors savon, which is the Hebrew word for soap. And that was because of this myth that Nazis turned, their Jewish victims into soap. Not true, but that's irrelevant. The point is that they used a term that was extremely insensitive and hateful. And Israel really weaponizes and uses the Holocaust to justify everything it does, but they also have a very kind of contemptuous relationship with the Holocaust, because you see this even today. People will post, we're not your grandparents' Jews, and they post a picture of Jews in concentration camps, and then on top of that they post a picture of armed Israelis, IDF soldiers. So they both use the Holocaust and also denigrate Holocaust survivors.
Wow.
And basically, it's a really kind of despicable weaponization. It's already bad enough to weaponize it, to say that because we were almost wiped out, we're going to ethnically cleanse others. That's one level, but to do that also while disdaining the victims of the extermination campaign makes it a different level of sordid.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
That's just as quick sidebar, and then we'll get to the main thing. There was a wonderful book, very popular, I think in the 80s, 70s and 80s, called The Joy of Yiddish. Have you ever heard of that book?
Mm-mm.
It was a super bestseller. Everybody was reading it. And I probably know about 20 or 30 Yiddish words because my violin teacher spoke Yiddish. And so, I don't know what's a nice word or a bad word, so I'm not going to say any of them.
Yeah,
but
I
knew.
The non-bad words are like schlepp, schmear,
Schlemiel
is okay. Yeah.
Okay. He would often describe people as schlemiels. It was fun. It was nice to know a few other words.
And then of course putz and schmuck are famous ones.
Right.
Not as nice.
Everyone knows those. Yeah. And then what's the one? A good guy is a mensch.
Mensch. Yeah.
Right. So some of these words have made it, but there are also some specialized words. I felt like I had a few inside knowledge words, from him.
And thanks to Israel, this is basically, some religious Jews are still speaking Yiddish, but there's a whole Yiddish culture and language that's basically been decimated.
Yeah. So there was theater, because I think I mentioned on the recording part of the call, one of my classmates at college, and he's been a friend and a business colleague for decades. His grandfather was like a star of the Yiddish theater. So there was theater, there was literature, I imagine poetry, of course. There were newspapers.
Yeah.
It was a very vibrant culture. So how did Israel treat those people? Like garbage.
Yeah.
Pretty much, right? And then they created a language that's not, they call it Hebrew, but it's not even Hebrew.
Yeah, it wasn't spoken by anyone, modern Hebrew. Yeah.
And
Yaakov Shapiro can read and write in Hebrew, but it's not the Hebrew that they speak in Israel.
Gotcha. And then there's a lot of weird words I can't think of some of the examples, but strange words they used, like basically that have violence implicit in them and warfare implicit in them. So
We were one thing is that it's interesting that speaking of Yiddish, when I was in Ireland, and a lot of people, these are other words, use the word shtick and spiel, and I don't think they know it's Yiddish. I was speaking to some Irish people, and they didn't even know it's Yiddish. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but while
Yeah.
I was in Ireland, I did a live show of the Katie Halper show, which I'll be releasing soon, first on Patreon, patreon.com/the Katie Halper show.
Okay.
And one of my guests, a professor, Asad Bouchark, read the lyrics of the Israeli national anthem, and it is so violent. It was
Wow.
like one of the best parts of the show, I think, was him reading that. Yeah.
Wow. What do you know when that's going to air? Have you any idea the date?
No,
Okay.
because it's one of these things. It's like really good quality, high quality. So the footage it takes a while to process. We also interviewed. So I was in for work. I was in for work on the film on the documentary. We went to Berlin, Brussels, and London. And then for a friend's wedding, and then for work on the Katie Halper show, because I did a show and then I also gave a talk. We were in Ireland for a week, which is
Oh,
fascinating because
great.
they have so much solidarity. I mean, you can't walk like a block without seeing a pro-Palestine sign. And we also interviewed Jeremy Corbyn. So stand by for that.
Oh, great.
That is mostly, it's not all for my show. Probably the majority of the interview with Corbyn will probably it is for the documentary, but I
Okay.
definitely spoke to him about other things for my, for viewers of the Katie Halper show.
Great. Wow.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see the Irish thing. I know that there's tremendous solidarity. And then there's a
Yeah.
city, I think it's Glasgow in Scotland, that has a lot of Irish people in it. There's a couple of cities in like Liverpool has a lot of Irish
Right.
people, Manchester. And there's
Yeah.
a whole you're probably aware there's this whole soccer team in Glasgow that's all behind Palestine. They have been for years. Did you know
Wow.
that?
Yeah. No, I didn't know
Oh,
about that. I'm very dumb
um,
about sports, but it's
let me,
fascinating.
since we have video, I'm just going to go. I'll show you the t-shirt. Hang
Sure.
on.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
These guys are mad for Palestine and have
Oh,
been for
cool.
many,
Green
many
Brigade.
years.
Oh, yeah. They even have the Palestine colors.
Yeah, and they you know, they sing, you know, Palestine solidarity songs
Oh,
at the things and they were this is a like a super fan group within the soccer team, right? And they were actually banned from the stadium because they dared to sing the some kind of song for solidarity,
right.
but they've been allowed back in, and they go to Palestine. They've run soccer
Oh, that's
clinics.
so great.
And that's what's not being,
And
yeah,
one thing I just
reported.
want to
Yeah.
add is that what's really cool is that when the live show I did, it was supposed to have this really funny comedian who's great, Irish, who does a lot of Palestine solidarity, like humor, actually making fun of Zionists, obviously not Palestinians. Ty Hickey, he had COVID, so he couldn't come, but he did Zoom in, so he's featured in the show also. But the other person I had there in person was Danny Morrison, who's a former Republican prisoner who used to do like media for Sinn Féin, and also he's also a great writer of novels and plays. And he currently is the secretary of the Bobby Sands Trust, which is something that is dedicated to like cultural productions around Bobby Sands. So he was another guest. So it was really fascinating to have those two in conversation. And they actually co-edited a great book called Shared Struggle about Irish and Palestinian hunger strikers.
Oh, great. Had you ever
Yeah.
been to Ireland before?
I had like when I was right between high school and college, but I hadn't been to Dublin. I was in County Clare, which is beautiful. I was in the Burren. This time we were in Dublin, Ballybunion, which is County Kerry, Sligo, which is actually one of my favorite parts of Ireland. I highly recommend Sligo. It's beautiful. Sligo, where I spoke at a Palestinian, Irish Palestinian solidarity meeting. And then Belfast, where I got an amazing tour from Danny Morrison of all the murals.
Oh, right. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's on Patreon right now, the videos that I did with the video of my tour with Danny. And in Sligo, we got to stay with a former mayor of Sligo. Declan Bree is his name. He's really amazing. He does a lot of solidarity work with Palestine. He was also an MP in Ireland. And we also met up with Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, who were members of the European Parliament. people have definitely seen, if you don't know who they are, you've definitely seen videos of them. She's always making really they both make really fiery speeches. They lost their seats, unfortunately, but they're great. And so it's really fun to meet up with them.
The kind of people that make me proud to have Irish
Oh
ancestry.
yeah, yeah. And Claire Daly she's like, we don't support you, Biden. Butcher Biden. She calls him Butcher Biden. Yeah.
It must have been refreshing to be in a country where all that was out in the open.
Yeah, it is. It was. I made that point in a talk that it's nice when you're in a country where like the default is solidarity with Palestinians. It makes sense. Obviously, it makes sense. I mean, they should have a shared history of colonialism and occupation and violence, and then also a shared kind of now what Palestine doesn't have is a huge Palestinian American population that helps support it the way that Ireland has with Irish Americans.
Hmm.
Um, and like historically, right? So,
Right.
but they also have a shared demonization and vilification. And when there has been violent resistance, even though most of the resistance from Palestine and Ireland was nonviolent, but then when you have violent resistance, all of a sudden violence is bad, but the violence that has been perpetuated by Israel in the case of Palestine, England in the case of Ireland, those are, which obviously are much bigger, more
Yeah.
powerful than the violent resistance and response. That's okay. That's sanitized. That's accepted. That's not called terrorism. The only thing that's called terrorism is when the people who are being occupied do it.
Yeah, it's the same old trick.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know this, but during the so-called potato famine, Ireland was exporting food
Yeah.
nonstop, and they
Yeah.
needed a huge number of troops with their horses and the hay that they needed and so on to be escorts to take the food out of along the roads to the docks and send them out. And just like they boycott, or not boycott, they blockade Gaza, they
Right.
blockaded Ireland too. They would tell ships that were bringing relief, turn around and go away. People were not allowed to fish. It was a crime to go fishing during
Right.
a
Like they
famine.
do, like the same, and they do that in Gaza. You're only allowed to fish in certain waters and they'll shoot at you if you go outside of a certain perimeter. And yeah, the famine, I was reading a book called The Famine Plot, England's Role in Ireland's Greatest tragedy. And it talks about how this was not I mean, obviously it was partly a natural thing that kind of natural crop related disaster, but it was also totally human made. And it was a policy decision.
Yeah, there's a fellow, and I'm trying to think of his name. He's an LA writer. Uh, but he wrote books about the fact that you always hear, at least when I was growing up, you'd hear about, eat your spinach because there are starving children in China.
Yeah.
All those famines in China, at least in the 19th century and in India, were all British induced.
Yeah. They're
They
really good at
weren't
that.
natural. I mean, things go wrong, crops fail, but
Sure. Right.
usually people can work it out.
Yeah,
But
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, so it's interesting that
And
this,
some people consider the Great Hunger, as it's called, uh, a genocide.
it's hard for me to think of it, any other way.
Yeah.
Amazingly, of all the countries in Europe, Ireland still has not recovered its population from before the Great Hunger. I mean,
Yeah.
they were hit very hard.
Very hard. Yeah. And then there was obviously a lot of emigration. Yeah.
So it's beautiful to see that natural solidarity. And Irish people are ass kickers. They're not going to stop. Um, so let's go back to this topic, which isn't really discussed enough, which is for the abusiveness of the Zionists against Jewish people. So we've touched a little bit on it. If you were a Holocaust survivor and you ended up in Israel, the Zionists would refer to you as soap. I mean, which is so psycho. It defies belief. Uh, Yiddish, which is a beautiful, expressive, extremely human language, was banned. If you spoke Yiddish, you were dirt. You had to learn
Right.
this make-believe fascistic construction called modern
Hebrew.
Hebrew. But that I call it's like sort of a form of terrorism. It's mental terrorism,
Mm.
and it didn't just happen in Israel against Yiddish-speaking Jews. It's an ongoing thing. I encounter many Jewish people in America, or when we say Jewish, what do we mean? It's like when you say Italian, what do you mean? It's
Right.
such a vague Or if you say African, well, do you mean South Africa? Do you mean Morocco?
Right.
Do you mean the
Right.
Congo? What are you talking about? It's too vague. But still, a lot of people that are identified as being Jewish are terrified to speak up about what's going on, not because of well, specifically because of the Zionist propaganda machine. Can you
Yeah,
talk about that a little bit?
yeah, they'll be smeared, they'll be fired, they'll be smeared as self-loathing Jews or as anti-Semites. There are Israelis who are imprisoned for criticizing Israel, or not even criticizing Israel. There was an Israeli teacher who was imprisoned just for posting stuff that's sympathetic to Palestinians on Facebook. And you see images of the Israeli police beating Israeli protesters, hostages, families. I mean, it's a similar thing with the way that they weaponize the hostage issue while also, I mean, Israel has killed more hostages than they've freed. They could not care less about the hostages, or else they'd be negotiating, which is what you always do. But there have been, police have been really rough on families of hostages, family members of the hostages.
Wow.
They're Orthodox Jews who get bashed and beaten by the Israeli police. And it's really a sick society. You know, it's not just, there are some brave individuals who will go to jail instead of serving, who speak out against what Israel's doing. But it's a very small minority, because the whole country is, I mean, everyone serves. That's one part of it. So they all become indoctrinated. And, you know, it was founded on this trauma and weaponized. It's not like it was an innocent response to trauma. It was a weaponization of trauma. And, you know, you've asked me a lot about Jewish identity. You know, one of the things that I identify with is the idea of never again means never again for anyone. Israel's never again is very much never again for Jews. And we're going to use that to justify everything we do. And it's kind of the opposite takeaway. And in fact, so one of, you know, when I'm interviewing these Holocaust survivors, and their claim is not claim, their position is never again means never again for anyone. And how could we, who went through this, possibly support what Israel's doing? And I think you have a real split in the Jewish community. You have people for whom never again means never again for anyone. And you have people who say never again just for Jews. Yeah. And in fact, Netanyahu gave a speech where he says never again is now. And one of the people I interviewed, one of the survivors, brought that up as such a disgusting weaponization.
Absolutely. And then there's this class that I call the country club Jew. There's this rabbi out of the Upper East Side, and he streams his stuff, so it's on YouTube. You can watch it. And I mean,
that's funny. I call them Park Avenue Jews.
Oh, Park Avenue. Okay, there you go.
Which is, for people who don't know, that's on the Upper East Side. Yeah.
And I get how that, you know, country club Park Avenue dynamic works. You know, you want to be part of the group. Okay, everybody wants to be part of a group. I get that part. You have all these different business relationships. You want to keep them healthy and happy. I get that. But it seems like part of the price of admission is you have to say, yes, Israel, no matter what. And it's kind of shocking. And to see a religious person basically advocating, and this is not a Meir Kahane guy. You know, this is, in fact, tragically, this is a guy who before was worried about what was happening in Israel and actually spoke about that in the temple when he, you know, on Saturdays.
Wow. What changed? When did this change?
October 7, you know?
Wow. Yeah.
And I don't mean to trivialize October 7. It, you know, it was an act of violence. But it was largely
an act of violence that Israel participated in, we know.
Well, and that's the whole other issue.
Yeah.
I think for the Palestinians, it was a military incursion. They had military targets. And, you know, they're kind of at war with Israel because Israel's at war with them. Now, we don't know how many people the Israeli army, the IDF, killed.
Right.
And
but we know they did kill some.
They might have killed a whole lot.
Yeah, right. I'm just saying what we do know is that there are at least some.
Yeah, if people ever, you know, when you see the photographs of the burned out cars at the music festival, You can't do that one at a time. You need
Right.
high-powered aerial machinery to do
Right.
that. The only people that had that was the IDF that day.
Yeah, we actually so the other show I do, Useful Idiots, which I co-host with Aaron Mate, we actually interviewed this great guy named Maoz Inon, whose parents were killed tragically on October 7th. And Aaron brought up, he's like, do you think that maybe it was Israel who killed your parents? And he's like, I can't think of that. Like I can't even allow that because what it would mean.
It's,
Like it's a
it's
scary thought to think that your own government would do it, but I mean,
it's this
I
huge cognitive dissonance thing, and it's a human problem. It's not that, they're not being deliberately thick-headed.
no, yeah. And I
You
really admire this person for, again, he's kind of like instead of saying because my parents were killed, let's kill a bunch of innocent Palestinians. He's saying don't do this in their name.
yeah, it's interesting. I'm going through my archive right now, my print archive, and my way of dealing with my archive is to throw stuff in boxes. When the boxes get full, I bring them up to the attic. I've been doing that for
Yeah.
35 years. And I finally went into the archive. And anyway, one of the things I found was a book on 2000, on 9/11. And there was a beautiful photograph of it, of a bunch of women holding signs that said, and I'm paraphrasing,
Grief is not a cry for war.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. You have
Exactly.
this woman, Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who I actually know personally. My mom and uncle grew up with, went to college with them, and their son was tragically killed on 9/11. And Phyllis in particular, became an activist. They both were, they wrote an op-ed right away that, can you imagine this? The New York Times did not publish. Seems pretty newsworthy, saying not in our name. And she became a real activist for restorative justice.
Great, which is a really important movement.
Yeah. And also was against the invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah, what's happening now is sort of similar. You had I mean, who knows about 9/11? I mean, who knows what really happened? I mean, and when I look at those photos, because there's a lot of photos in the book that I have never seen since. And I don't want to go down the 9/11 rabbit hole, but it surely was not Afghani civilians that organized that.
Sure.
It surely was not Iraqi babies that organized that. And yet those are the ones that were slaughtered. And which is exactly what's happening in Gaza.
Right. And again, it's interesting. It's like, not only is that wrong ethically and morally, but that does not make Americans safer. Just
Not
like
at
this
all.
doesn't make Jews safer. I think the other interesting thing with October 7th is that part of the reason it happened was because the Israeli army was busy in the West Bank defending settlers. And another interesting thing is that they keep saying this is the, worst attack since the Holocaust. The Holocaust was killing Jews for being Jews. October 7th was not about Jews. It was about the occupation. And it also undermines the claim that Israel is the safest place for Jews.
Yeah, which is, I mean, and I don't want to be flippant, but really, how about the Upper East Side? How about Chicago?
Upper
How
West
about Los
Side,
Angeles, right? I mean, those are pretty safe places for Jewish people to live these days. And I understand years ago, decades ago, it was a different world.
Sure.
It was a different world for Italians.
Yeah, I mean, and you also have, like, there was the shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh. But it's not, statistically, it's not, there are not a lot of Jewish hate crimes anymore.
In reality, of course, now they're changing the stats by if you question Israel, you are now engaging in a hate crime.
Yeah, the ADL considers Jewish Voice for Peace to be a hate organization, an anti-Semitic organization. So whenever they have a protest, that goes down in their book as, in their records as anti-Semitic. Also, there's a really great movie that I highly recommend called Defamation. It took a couple of years. It's old, but it's about this Jewish Israeli director goes to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, to kind of film, and they assume that he's friendly because he's a Jewish Israeli, and they are totally open in front of him, and you see how ridiculous their definition of anti-Semitism is.
There's another
examples.
Yeah, there's another really good film that came out. Is it called Israelism?
Israelism, yeah.
Israelism.
That's a great film that's about young Jews who are, rejecting Zionism, unlearning Zionism, yeah.
And it shows the incredible efforts the Zionists go to indoctrinate and brainwash young Jewish Americans.
Right. And it also, actually, interestingly enough, features Abe Foxman, the former head of the ADL, and he's the head of the ADL when that movie Defamation was made.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if he'll talk to me for my documentary.
That'd be
I think
interesting.
he may. I mean, it's obvious that like he'll know my perspective, and I would tell him what my film is about. But he also is a survivor, so it'd be interesting to have.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I hope he'll man up and
yeah,
put himself in front of the camera
yeah,
and give his side of it, right?
yeah,
We'll hear what he has to say.
yeah,
Um, so that's in addition to the propaganda there, I want to go back to this sort of psychological terrorism against the Jewish people. I'm aware of it in the United States because I have so many Jewish friends that they're like, oh my God, Ken, be careful. I can't tell you the number of Jewish people who like I have this, I don't know, I think I sent you a copy. We put the South African complaint
oh yeah,
in
yeah.
book form.
I
So
do
it's
have that.
all
Yeah,
here
thanks
with
for
all the
doing that. That's
footnotes,
great.
and then we just launched this one. Um, this one's a bomb.
Oh yeah, I saw that. You have to send me one of those.
I will.
Send me
I
that.
will.
Okay, great.
And I'll ask you for the address after we're off.
Yeah,
And the first thing a lot of my Jewish friends say is be careful.
yeah.
I'm like, be careful of what? Because they're terrorized. I won't mention her name, but I know somebody, she's worked for decades on a very important area of social justice. I mean, a real courageous person. Her family was picked up when they lived in Romania. They picked her up and brought the family to what is now Ukraine. They were in camps, um, they let her, it's a long story, but she went through it. She went through the
Yeah,
whole thing and she's brave as hell. And she just can't raise her head. She can't say anything.
right,
And it's that's how deep the psychological warfare is against Jewish people
right.
by these Zionists. And one of the reasons because I grew up in New York City, it's like I think when I grew up in New York City, like 20% of all people in New York City were Jewish. It's just like so the culture it's just like it's part of life. And I realized there are a lot of people in other parts of the country where you may never have met a Jewish person, or you may
Right,
never have seen the beautiful parts of Jewish culture.
right.
And I'm always afraid that people are going to conflate Jewishness with Israel.
Yeah, it's very dangerous.
Yeah, and so
Yeah,
that's why we keep doing these shows. They're not at all, not only are they not in any way related, the Zionists are actually fighting against and brutalizing Jewish people.
yeah.
And it seems like an Alice in
And putting
Wonderland.
that at risk, putting
Yeah,
us at risk. Yeah.
yeah. Hey, tell us more about your film and about your Substack and how people can support your work.
Yeah.
And do you have are you going to have like a crowdfunding for the film at any point, you
Yeah,
think?
I think so. Yeah. I think we're going to do a trailer and then do that. But it's going to be amazing. These characters are so amazing. So my stuff is basically at Patreon. I mean, youtube.com/The Katie Halper Show. And then you can support that show and get extra content at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And you can subscribe. Please do subscribe and like at YouTube. And then you can also, if you're more of a podcast person, you can find it on wherever you find your podcasts. And please rate and review it.
Great. Yeah, all these little things, they seem like nothing, but if you give a thumbs up, if you
Yeah.
subscribe, if you write some notes,
Yeah.
this fascistic algorithm
Right.
demands this of us, and you will help boost. Because so far they're letting Katie stream on YouTube. They're not
Yeah.
banning her yet.
Right. Whenever I have Assange stuff, the numbers are kind of low. I think they maybe suppress that, but yeah.
Yeah. So this
They
is a
do
way
let
to
me.
support, and then it's Substack Katie Halper.
I think so, honestly.
Well, you know what? We'll figure it out
Okay.
and we'll put it as
But
a
yeah.
caption
Yeah.
below.
Yeah.
I always say this, we get the media we deserve. We don't get the medical system we deserve. We don't get the school system we deserve. We don't
Right.
get the representatives in Congress we deserve, but we
Right.
do get the media we deserve because we all buy the newspaper. We all pay our cable bill. So if you like what people like Katie are doing, it's very important to include them in your spending on media.
Thank you. Yeah.
Super important.
Yeah.
Super important.
Sometimes people are like, I don't think people realize that I have to pay people who work for me and with me. And also I have to be able to pay my rent. So, in case people some are wondering why I have a Patreon.
Yeah, I mean, nobody says, well, why am I paying the New York Times for a
Right.
subscription? Why don't they
Yeah.
just do
They
it for free
definitely
and
just,
deliver it to my
right.
house? Well,
Right.
it doesn't work that way. And so we have this new, thank God, we have this new media world where people like Katie can bring us this information. And we have to remember it takes money to do
Yeah.
this kind of work.
Right.
So Katie, I want to really thank you so much for what you
Thanks for having
do.
me. Thank you.
And guys, if you haven't seen the show, you put out a lot of short clips, but
Yeah.
I love the long clip. It's like being with a really smart friend who has a really
Oh,
great sense
thanks.
of humor, who has all these interesting people on.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a good. I mean, it's not, it's not an entertaining subject, but the
Right.
way you present it is palatable. I don't know what the right word is, but you convey a lot of information that's very important, and it's also fun because you
Yeah.
actually have comedians on, and
Yeah.
you
We
know
try to make it, I mean, it's like there's so much tragedy in the world, and uh I think it's important to create joy. And people sometimes will be like, "Well, are you just preaching to the choir?" And a couple things I would say is that I've actually had people who've watched my show, and then I'm not taking credit for it, but they've changed their minds. I think it's probably because of my guests more than anything else, but they have changed their minds. But I also really highly believe in, you know, energizing the choir. Like the choir needs to be supported, have joy, so it doesn't burn out.
it's all about morale.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah,
about
it really is.
morale,
Yeah.
and in the military, they know that. They
Right.
know that if they don't keep the morale of the troops up, things are not going to go well. So this morale boosting is really, really important. So
Yeah.
yeah, whenever somebody says preaching to the choir, I always like, why not?
Yeah. Yeah. We have to. And my live streams are Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then, as you said, I release clips like every day of the week, shorter clips. And there's always extra content at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And
Great.
if anyone wants to donate to this documentary, reach out to me. I don't know how. I guess I'll just comment on one of my public Patreon posts.
Okay. You might, and you could let us know if you need any help with this. Just to like have a page, just say
Yeah,
coming
I should do
soon,
that. Yeah,
and
I should. That's a good
great.
idea with the link.
Well,
Yeah, very good
yeah,
idea.
I'm so glad you're working on this. This is such an important
Thanks.
topic.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Katie. And
Thanks
again,
so much.
we'll put all the ways to reach Katie below, and we'll catch you around the internet.
Great. Thanks, Ken.
Okay.
Bye.